Adrian Stokes was an art critic who was analysed by Melanie Klein in the 1930s and subsequently developed a theory of art based on her theory of child development, although he scrupulously avoided mentioning either her name or the names of any of her concepts. Nevertheless, his notion of art as a negotiation between two opposing modes comes directly from Klein, who saw the fundamental job of infancy as managing the transition from a state where there is little, if any, distinction between self and world, to one where separateness is acknowledged and valued for its own sake. The baby grapples with this situation in the first year or two of life, but the issue is never fully resolved, and the pattern established in the early months tends to repeat with variations throughout a person's life. Klein, like Freud, tended to look at artworks as a set of symptoms to be read off and interpreted, rather than as a problem or issue worked through and transformed in a given medium. Stokes's great contribution, then, was to produce a theory of the medium that was compatible with the psychoanalytic model of the mind. He was also a still life and landscape painter. He never made great claims for his paintings and described himself as a poor man's Bonnard. Nevertheless, the interest in merging and separation is clearly visible in his paintings. At the outbreak of war in 1939, he moved to St Ives, where Bernard Leach lived and worked, and he persuaded Barbara Hepworth and Ben Nicholson to join him. So the example of St Ives as a modernist art centre is partly his creation. Stokes adapted a traditional distinction between carved and modelled work and made it his own by filling it with a new content. Traditionally, carved work is made by the removal of material and modelled work by its accretion. Here are two obvious and quite extreme examples. The jade stone axe has been carved. The shape has been made initially by chipping away at a block of jade and then by rubbing and smoothing and polishing. Its shape is abstract, transitioning from a pointed mass at one end to a broad flattened blade at the other. It's a functional object, perfectly balanced, though in this case, being made of jade, it was ceremonial, not intended for use. In this, it's like some contemporary studio ceramics. Who has ever put flowers in a Hans Koper vase? On the right is a modelled figure by Duccio Fontana. The clay has been squeezed between his fingers to form all these complex irregular shapes. The sculpture was constructed by Fontana taking small pieces of clay and kneading and then adding them to the growing object. The sense of the clay's squashiness is so strong, even after firing and glazing, that it takes a few minutes to see the whole of the figures, to see the white baby held in the crook of the mother's arm, to see the pair's joyful, echoing gestures, to distinguish the Madonna's white head from the purple and blue robe and headdress. Stokes's fundamental innovation was to extend the meaning of carving and modelling so as to include the reactions of the viewer. He demonstrates what he means through a comparison of these two reliefs, a Pieta by Donatello and a Madonna and Child with Angels by Agostino di Duccio. Both pieces are carved in the narrow technical sense, but Stokes argues that the Donatello exhibits a modelling conception and Agostino's a carving conception. He defines carving and modelling like this. Whatever its plastic value, a figure carved in stone is fine carving when one feels that not the figure, but the stone through the medium of the figure has come to life. Plastic conception, modelling, on the other hand, is uppermost when the material with which, or from which, a figure has been made appears as no more than as so much suitable stuff for this creation. His definition is deliberately strange. It's not the figure through the medium of the stone, but the stone through the medium of the figure that he says is brought to life. What does this definition mean in practice? First of all, he means that the Donatello is conceived as a dramatic juxtaposition of volumes through chiaroscuro, whereas the Agostino is conceived as a diffusion of planes across a surface. And when he says conceived, he means both by the artist and by the viewer. Secondly, he wants us to see the motivation of Donatello's forms in the distribution of weight. The slumping body of the dead Christ is presented as a thing with real weight, and the strain of supporting that weight can be seen in the arms and legs of the angels. In contrast to this, the Agostino is almost completely weightless. The infant Christ is supported by the Madonna's shoulder, by her right hand, and by the frame, but the idea of strain is quite absent. Nothing presses upon anything else. The motivation for the forms here, Stokes argues, is the surface or the character of the stone itself. Both reliefs use perspective, but to very different ends. In the Donatello, look at the foreshortening of the angel's hand, which supports Christ's head. This accords with and emphasises the quality of weight through its power to compress shape. By contrast, Agostino uses perspective in conjunction with very shallow relief to enlarge shape. Stokes points out how characteristically the bottom of each object is seen from above, the middle from eye level, and the top from underneath. This can be seen quite clearly in the vase in the right-hand corner, where this procedure is followed without any regard for the general perspectival scheme. Thus all objects appear to be slightly convex, which harmonises with the gentle rounding each plane is given. The effect of this, Stokes argues, is to maximise any given object's surface area, which in turn emphasises its exteriority. In addition to this, the process is almost reversed on those parts of objects that are of especial interest, i.e. the heads. So reading the Virgin's head vertically, we see part of the underside of her chin, we see her eyes at eye level, and we see part of her head above her left temple from above. While reading laterally, from right to left, we see her ear in profile, her nose in 3/4, while the left side of her face is only slightly tilted away from a frontal view. Donatello's relief is cut much deeper than Agostino's, and in places undercut, which Agostino's is not. The viewer, Stokes claims, is thereby made sensible of a divorce between the background and the foreground. This fractures or prevents the sense of the stone itself as a continuous material from playing any vital role in the perception of the piece. The background shapes, the other angels, whose presence is only lightly indicated, still have an aesthetic relevance as shapes in terms of the composition, but, he says, they have no connection as surfaces to those of the foreground. He writes, "The layers of the stone are treated wholesale. Though some of the cutting is beautiful in itself, the relief betrays a wilful, preconceived manner of approach. In brief, the composition is not so much founded on the interrelationship of adjoining surfaces as upon the broader principles of chiaroscuro. Stress and strain is the point. Anatomy, the then unrivalled plastic subject, is the point." In contrast to this, the shaping of forms in the Agostino are flattened so as to preserve the character of the block. And one consequence of this is that the shapes remain readable even when seen obliquely, while the sense of Donatello's shapes steadily diminishes as the viewer moves to one or the other side. Stokes argues that the two reliefs also demonstrate quite different conceptions of the relation of one shape to another. He claims that the relation of shape to shape is much weaker in the Donatello than it is in the Agostino. But he passes over the most obvious example, where Christ's arm aligns with the angel's wing, and his fingers poignantly echo the feathers. Instead, he directs the viewer's attention to the definite transition in the Donatello from Christ's arm to the angel's face, where one shape cuts across and interrupts another. While in the Agostino, he claims there is a continuity of shape. Stokes writes that the shape of the infant's head causes the shapes of the angels' heads, rather like ripples spreading in a pond. In fact, he goes further than this and says, "See the angel's head at the bottom of the relief, his hand clinging to the frame as if he had emerged from the back layers and had passed through the Virgin to the front, or as if the stone were a sea in which he rocked by his hand to and from a breakwater." It's the idea of water that is important here, and Stokes makes much metaphorical capital from the aquatic origins of limestone. The two reliefs, then, aim at provoking very different responses from their viewers. In the Donatello, there is great pathos in the angel's hand laid upon Christ's torso, though at the time of writing, Stokes was fairly dismissive of this and calls it only a general tactile reminder. The point is, nevertheless, that the sense of touch is central to the impact of the relief. The physical contact between virgin and child in the Agostino carries none of this freight. It's characteristic of carving work that it doesn't exhibit this kind of incident, though Stokes suggests that if we want to find an element of similar emotional intensity, we should look at the interval, the gap, between the heads of the virgin and the child. What he values in this is both its slightness and what he calls its irreversibility. There it all is, he writes, so completely set out in space that one cannot entertain a single afterthought. Emotional maturity for both Stokes and Klein requires the separation of mother and child, and it's easy to see then how this tiny but distinct space between the mother and the baby in the relief could take on such a profound significance for Stokes in relation to Klein's theory of child development. The concerns that he wishes to alert the viewer to when he talks of carving and modelling are not merely technical. Stokes is certainly sensitive to the design of artworks, but what is crucial, he believes, is the felt relation of the design to the medium. In modelling work, he argues, this relation is slight. The material just suffices to support the design, but it's not felt to contribute to the significance of the piece. Anything less than this would presumably lead to the physical disintegration of the artwork. In the best carving work, by contrast, the relation between the medium and the design is so rich that it is the medium itself that becomes the focus of the viewer's attention. It's also significant that he uses the word medium in relation to carving and material in relation to modelling. The idea of a medium presupposes a relation between the things that it mediates, which the idea of material does not. The theory of carving and modelling is an attempt to articulate the sense of a medium and the role this sense plays in the perception of art. He suggests that the transformation of material into medium for both artist and spectator depends on a special kind of mental activity. He writes, "If we would understand a visual art, we ourselves must cherish some fantasy of the material that stimulated the artist, and ourselves feel some emotional reason why his imagination chose, when choice was not altogether impelled by practical, technical, and social considerations, to employ one material rather than another." Stokes's idea is that it is only if we can sustain a fantasy about the material as material that we will be able to understand how this material is transformed into a medium in the work of art. And he doesn't just say that we must entertain some sort of fantasy about the artist's material if we would understand carving, but that we must approach all visual art in this way. This doesn't contradict his earlier statement about modelling work having only the slightest relation to its medium, but it's important to keep in mind the distinction he makes between material and medium. Stokes argues that the fantasy the viewer must inevitably entertain about modelled work is that the material offers no resistance to the creative impulse. The modelling conception achieves expression through the rhythmic and dramatic articulation of form. So the fantasies related to the material are of critical importance to the understanding of modelled work, but these fantasies are of an infinitely malleable and thus rather characterless stuff. In other words, the more a work of art approaches a purely modelling conception, the less obtrusive is the sense of material as medium. In carved work, by contrast, the material is approached as something already possessing some sort of identity and integrity, and is worked with the aim of retaining and augmenting these qualities. Material for the carver is viewed from the beginning as something more exterior to and separate from the self. The fantasies that Stokes believes are essential to understanding art may be conscious or unconscious. He devotes about 2/3 of Stones of Rimini to the elaboration of the type of fantasy that he believes is activated in the viewing of Agostino's reliefs in the Tempio Malatestiano in Rimini. It's an astonishing piece of writing in which geology, geography, history, myth and poetry combine to create for limestone a central place in the evolution of his notion of Mediterranean culture. At the time he wrote Stones of Rimini, Stokes was very interested in the modernist practice of direct carving and the notion of truths and materials that he found in Hepworth and Moore. And so while he prized carved work, he tended to be dismissive of modelling. However, in subsequent decades, he revisited modelling work and recognised that these fantasies and practices of working had an equal validity. It's worth looking at the types of fantasies that he thought were involved with each mode. Firstly, modelled work evokes fantasies of envelopment. Some of Monet's later paintings envelop the viewer. This is a very large painting, about 7 feet high and about 15 feet long. When you stand in front of a painting like this, it's sometimes difficult to see the edges, and so it seems physically to occupy your whole perceptual field. It's a painting of the lily pond in the garden that Monet built at Giverny. It shows the surface of the water, the depth of the pond, and the reflection of the sky. And although we see all that without too much difficulty, it's difficult to point to one place and say, this is a reflection of the tree at the edge of the water, or this is the weed growing at the bottom of the pond. And the closer you get to it, the harder it becomes to give a particular purpose to the marks Monet has made. His way of painting blurs the border between one object and another. I suppose we would call this a landscape painting, but it's a peculiar one. There's no horizon and no foreground. There's nothing beyond the pond. The painting doesn't give us a position, a shoreline from which we see the pond. We seem to glide or float over it. If these qualities were not sufficient to produce those feelings of envelopment by themselves, Monet designed a pair of oval rooms in the basement of the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris to house paintings like these. As you walk into and around the space, you are surrounded on every side by these massive lily ponds. They invite you to lose yourself in the peaceful, amorphous spaces of these surroundings. Monet is not the only artist to have thought about his work in this way. The Rothko room in Tate Modern is also an immersive experience. The feelings people experience in this space are varied. For some, they are as peaceful and benign as Monet's lily ponds. But for others, this is a disturbing, even oppressive experience. Rothko had been commissioned to paint these for the Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram building in New York. And while he accepted the commission, he was unhappy about it, and is recorded as saying, "I hope to ruin the appetite of every son of a bitch who ever eats in that room." So the oceanic feeling of envelopment is not always or necessarily benign. When fantasies of envelopment become overpowerful, things bleed into one another, and the distinction between self and world is lost. Yayoi Kusama is famous for covering things in polka dots and other simple repetitive patterns. She talks about these works as self-obliteration, and when everything is covered in the same way, the borders between objects become harder to distinguish. She does this to photos of herself, and she also creates environments where through repetition and reflection, the visitors have difficulty in apprehending the dimensions of the space that they are in and the position of their own bodies. It may take you a moment or two to work out where the figure, and her reflection, is in this photo. Kusama's installations provoke varied reactions. They may be experienced as a mystical union with the universe or as a form of terrifying annihilation. This effect is not dependent on scale. The Passing Winter is not a large work. It's about the height of a person. It's a simple cube with holes cut into the sides and mirrored inside and out. For many people, looking into the cube provokes laughter when they see their own and other people's reflections multiplied to infinity. But there are also plenty of people who withdraw in shock after the first glance because the experience is deeply disturbing. Stokes also associates modelling work with fantasies of omnipotence. Because the material is treated as if it offered no resistance, the only limits appear to be the limits of the artist's imagination. This sculpture by Rodin is called the Hand of God. It's Rodin's own hand, holding one of Rodin's sculptures. In it, Rodin claims a godlike power for the artist. Just as in the Bible, God takes earth and models it into the shape of a human and then breathes life into it, so Rodin here claims the power to produce whatever he wants. The idea, the will, is everything. The material is nothing. This is an exaggeration, of course, as no artist really ignores their materials, but there is a pleasure in the thought that their resistance can be overcome by sheer willpower alone. These fantasies are present almost whenever we come across a piece of virtuoso work. When Bernini carves the softness of a thigh, gripped by a hand, we marvel at how he overcomes the hardness of the stone. With Monti's veiled Vestal Virgin, the sense we have of a translucent, gauzy fabric covering the woman's face is astonishing, and it overcomes both the hardness and the opacity of stone. And there are no chisel marks on either Bernini or the Monti, and modelled work also evokes fantasies of effortless perfection. Anish Kapoor's Cloudgate is assembled from many pieces, but it wouldn't work. That is, it wouldn't produce the pleasure that it does, and through that convey its particular experience to its viewers, if those parts were visible in the finished object. It had to be smoothed and polished until every trace of manufacture had vanished, and it appears now as this magical, miraculous, perfect object. This Qing dynasty bowl is also presented as a perfect object. It is intricate and faultless. The extraordinary difficulty in both making and decorating this bowl are overcome in the virtuoso performance of making. These ideas are also present in certain types of contemporary ceramics. So, for instance, in the bold twisting forms of Merete Rasmussen's works. The results look as effortless as running the edge of a pair of scissors along a strip of paper. Like the Qing bowl, the finished object carries no visible trace of either the artist's hand or the process of making. We don't seek this idea of perfection in all objects, or at least most people don't. Flower pots, for instance, are humble, utilitarian objects that we don't expect to be perfect. In fact, many people prefer the look of old, weathered flower pots to those just bought from the garden centre, and there are online tutorials on how to age and weather your new flower pots so they look more like those illustrated here. Old flower pots evoke this sense of continuity, of survival and endurance, and although these flower pots have not been carved, these are fantasies that Stokes connects with the carving mode. Some objects, for instance, evoke fantasies of reparation. In Monsters, Inc., part of the plot turns on the recovery of a door that has been destroyed. When it's finally put back together, it's not a perfect door, but its reassembly has taken a lot of labour, and so the damaged door is loved, while the original, undamaged door was just a tool, a thing to be used without thinking. Frank Auerbach's paintings famously take a long time to make. He worked on some of his drawings for so long and so hard that he wore through the paper, and we can see where he has had to patch it. The damage and the patches become part of the final drawing, and they're crucial to the sense of this being a hard-won image. Stokes found similar qualities in some of Ben Nicholson's work. The character of the cardboard here is revealed by rubbing, scraping and gouging. None of the circles are exactly circular, none of the straight lines are straight. Nicholson is not interested in producing a perfect object, but in harnessing the resistance of the material to the form of the relief. Its resistance distances it from its viewer. It's the opposite of the envelopment found in Monet, Rothko and others. The cardboard, this is Stokes' argument, is valued for its own sturdy fibrous quality, more than for its compliance with the artist's desire. The shapes Nicholson makes are intended to bring out the nature that the cardboard already has, rather than impose his own vision upon it. The same ideas inform many of Nicholson's drawings. Frequently, before he began to draw, he would spend some time rubbing the surface of the paper with various materials to emphasise the surface and to make the qualities of that surface visible. He also relied on the rubbed and stained surface to give him suggestions about the kind of drawing that would work on that particular sheet. Again, rather than treating the paper as a simple surface to receive the artist's idea, he saw his drawings as a way of augmenting and preserving the character that the paper already had. Stokes understood rubbing, scouring, scraping and so on as signs of love, and it may seem puzzling why he should have chosen these actions rather than others. He argues that everyday actions, like scrubbing the floor and polishing furniture, are performed to preserve the nature of an object rather than to change it, and are thus loving. All contact, however, even when it's very light, brings change. Over the centuries, people have come into the church and knelt to kiss the foot of this 15th century bronze sculpture of St. Peter in Paris. This is a very light contact, for less than a second probably, a pair of lips brush against bronze. Nevertheless, over time, this repeated devotion has worn the toes away, and it's amazing to think that kissing has done this to metal. The consequence is that even loving actions contain a destructive element. Love is at the core of Stokes' approach. He castigates Northern Europeans for not really loving stone, and wants to show his readers how, when stone is loved through the activity of an artist, it flowers. Love for Stokes requires an acknowledgement of separation. The object must be loved for its own sake, not just for what it can do for the lover. On several occasions he talks about stone blossom, where the surface has been worked to bring out the inner character of the block. Freud and Klein, among others, had discussed the way unconscious desires and fantasies informed the figurative and narrative content of artworks. The theory of carving and modelling allowed Stokes to also show how fantasy is as present in the way artists conceive of and use their material as it is in the figures they depict. An artist who can teach a viewer to love stone is greater than those who merely use stone to realise a design, however impressively it is done. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and visit my channel, Think of a Picture, where you'll find lots more short, thoughtful videos on art. Thank you.